So good morning. This week we'll be learning the Parsha of Devarim. We begin a new book, a new Sefer. This is the final of the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu. In it, we read about the parting words, the very last few moments that Moshe Rabbeinu shares with his fellow Jews that he's led through many, many years. And it's very interesting because as a final goodbye, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't just reminisce about the good old times, but in fact he does something quite different. The Parsha opens up, Elah HaDevarim, these are the words that Moshe Rabbeinu said, and it begins to enumerate various geographic locations where the Jewish people were traveling throughout their 40 years. And when we just read it, it just seems like geography. Moshe Rabbeinu says about the desert, on the plains of Arava. He starts speaking about Chatzeros, various geographic markers. And some of the commentators discuss this. Why does Moshe Rabbeinu start giving a geography class? The Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who is the grandson of Rashi, he says that what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing was just to give a precise geographic location where they were, and it enumerates these various locations. However, Rashi, his grandfather, Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchaki, the classic commentator on the Torah, he says Moshe Rabbeinu was actually giving them a veiled form of criticism. What's happening here is that Moshe Rabbeinu is alluding to the various places where various events took place. So when he starts mentioning Bamidbar, in the desert, he's not just giving a geographic location, he is alluding to the fact that when they were in the desert, they complained. In other words, the desert alludes to the time that the Jewish people complained and says, why are we in the desert here to die? And they complained, whether it was Mul Suf, when they were by the Yam Suf, and they said we should go back to Mitzrayim, whether they complained about Di Zahav, Moshe Rabbeinu complained the fact that they had too much gold and they worshipped the golden calf, and so on. So all of these locations are markers in their history as they sojourned through the desert because various painful events happened, the dispute with Korach, and so on. And Rashi's logic here is, as the Rebbe once explained, because the verse opens up, these are the words that Moshe Rabbeinu said, and then it starts talking about a bunch of all these geographic locations, as we mentioned. And it doesn't say what Moshe Rabbeinu said. It just says these are the words and starts naming places. So Rashi understood from this that, in fact, these places are what Moshe Rabbeinu said. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was attempting to admonish the Jewish people at this time, and he did it through enumerating these places. Why did he do that? Rashi says because mipnei kvodon shel Yisrael, because of he wanted to protect the dignity of his fellow Jews. He did not want to specify explicitly the events that transpired, their sins and so on, and therefore he alluded to them through the places where they transpired. So before we assess exactly what the magnitude and the legacy of these criticisms and how they impacted them and if they did or not, but let's take a step back and analyze for a second why indeed did Moshe Rabbeinu criticize them at this point. We're holding in the end of the Moshe Rabbeinu's life. At this time it is 5 weeks before his passing, approximately. It's Rosh Chodesh, Shvat. And what is Moshe Rabbeinu? If you had to say goodbye to someone, what would you do? You would talk about and reminisce the great times you had together, take a stroll down memory lane, all the nostalgia and whatnot. But Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't do all of that. He elects to criticize them at this point. So number one, why? Why do you choose that your parting words should be those of criticism? And if you are going to criticize, why now? If you have something to say about events that happened over the past 40 years, the people he's speaking to now are largely the new generation who are about to enter Eretz Yisrael. The generation, all of the people who have committed those sins, whether it was the sin of the Meraglim, whether it was the sin of complaining about the water or Korach or worshiping the golden calf, these were people that died out over the 40 years. They're no longer here, save for Kalev and Yehoshua, but largely the entire generation died out. So if he had something to say to them, he should have said it 40 years ago. So why depart amid words of criticism? Why say it? Why? And if you have to say it, why say it now? And finally, if you are going to say it, why did he say it in a very non-direct manner? Moshe Rabbeinu was a man of truth, a man of integrity, and he was someone who didn't shy away. He didn't cower from taking a stand and standing up for what is right and true. So generally, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu actually defended at every turn, at every moment where Hashem said he wanted to annihilate the entire nation. Moshe Rabbeinu stood faithfully by them. He said, if you're not going to forgive them, erase me from this book, from this Torah. So he's always defending them, and all of a sudden one day now, he's criticizing them. And when he does criticize them, it is in a very ambiguous and vague manner. So we need to explore this concept of admonishment, criticism through the Jewish lens. As we know, the concept of admonishment is, of course, a biblical command. The Torah says in the parsha of Kedoshim that the Torah says that you should not bear a grudge against another person, lo sisna. You should not hate another your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach samisecha. Rebuke, you shall rebuke your fellow. V'lo sisa alav chet, and you should not bear a sin on his account. So the logic or the rationale behind the command of admonishment, of tochacha, there are various approaches in the commentators. The Chinuch, one of the classic medieval commentators who gives a rationale, attempts to give a rationale for many of the commandments, he says that the mitzvah of tochacha is associated with the first part of the verse, which says that you should not bear a grudge in your heart, and therefore you should admonish. So it appears that the Torah is giving a good advice. It's giving us a good perspective on life. Don't hold something in. If you have something to say, you should say it. If it remains bottled up, it simmers, and it's ultimately going to explode into a conflict, into a very difficult situation, and therefore it's best to get something off your chest, say it to the person. If you have a grievance, if you have an issue, take it up with them and deal with it. The Nachmanides, Ramban, he says, it actually, the Ocheach Tochiach Samisecha is supposed to be associated with the second part of the verse, V'lo sisa alav chet, that you should not bear a sin on his account. In other words, the way we have to look at criticism, at Tochacha, is through the lens of mutual responsibility, of accountability. That is to say, we look at all of the Jewish people not as individuals, we are one unit, and thus the actions of our fellow don't exist in a vacuum. We are all interrelated, interdependent, and thus if someone were to commit a sin, that affects our life. And therefore, we need to admonish them, because if that person sins and I don't say anything, then I am going to bear responsibility for that person's actions. So therefore, we have this concept to rebuke. So therefore, what we see from the Jewish view, it's not about live and let live. Don't mix and meddle into someone else's life. It's not the right thing to do. You should not. You should just eventually get used to the way your children are behaving, the way your neighbors are behaving, your coworkers. Just live with it. Get used to it. The Torah is saying very clearly, if you see something wrong, you need to step up and protest and admonish, reprimand the person. However, it's not so easy. People don't take to criticism very easily, very well. People don't like when people meddle into their lives, into their children. Children don't like when their parents tell them what to do, or their in-laws, if your boss or your coworker tells you what to do. People don't like that. And in fact, many times you say something, and it doesn't go over very well. So at the worst, in the best case scenario, the person just ignores you, or it actually becomes a source of strife, of conflict. So how do we look at when it comes to criticism? What is the right approach? And the truth is, when we study traditional Jewish sources, it seems to be we get mixed signals. On the one hand, the Torah says it's brought down in the Talmud and various places that if a person, sort of in the vein of what Nachmanides says, that the person who has the ability to protest and doesn't bears a very, very serious responsibility. The Talmud tells us of a rabbi, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, one of the Tanoim, who had a dispute with the Chachamim, with his sages, with his fellow sages on Shabbos. If a cow is allowed to go out with the harness, with the strap around its horns, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said it's permitted. It's part of what it wears, and therefore it's not considered an extra burden that it's carrying. The Chachamim say no, it's not part of the accessory of the animal, and therefore it is forbidden because even our animals are obligated to rest on Shabbos. And the story goes that once he observed a neighbor of his that their cow was going out on Shabbos with the strap, and he did not protest, he didn't object. So, and in his mind, because he felt that the halacha was that a cow indeed is allowed to carry that on Shabbos in a public domain. But after consideration, he realized that since the halacha indeed is like the Chachamim, he should have protested. And he felt so bad that he started to fast. And he fasted so much that his teeth became blackened because of his numerous fasts. The Talmud in Shabbos tells us another interesting account, as we are in the 3 weeks of mourning, talks about at the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. So initially Hashem wanted to save the tzaddikim, the righteous people. So he wanted to make a mark on their forehead with a tuf that they should live, and a mark on the evil ones, tuf tamus, that they should die. So the angels of destruction would be able to distinguish between the righteous and the ones who weren't righteous. But the angels, the accusing angels, said, "Why should we save the righteous? They have seen a lot of evil and not protested." So they tried to come to their defense, and they said, well, they knew that if they would protest, at the end of the day, the Rishayim, the wicked, wouldn't listen to them. So they said, no, it's not a good enough answer. Because so Hashem knows they wouldn't listen, but the righteous, the tzaddikim, they didn't know that if they would protest, if they would admonish, that the wicked wouldn't listen to them. And therefore, they are worthy of dying. And in the end, it was the righteous people, the tzaddikim, who were killed first in the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. So the Talmud is illustrating the severity of not protesting, of not making, when you see an event happening that shouldn't be happening, you need to speak up, and if you don't, you bear tremendous responsibility. However, on the other hand, we find in the Talmud, in the tractate of Yevamot, it says an interesting statement. It says that just like it's a command to say something that will be listened to, it's a mitzvah not to say something that won't be listened to. In other words, people, sometimes they'll hear you criticize them and they won't listen to you. So if you know that they're not going to listen to you, it's actually better not to say anything. Because now, if you say something and they heard it and they don't do anything about it, so prior to that you could say they didn't know. But now they know and they're still doing it, so you're actually making a bad situation worse. So the Talmud says better not to say anything. And since this is the nature of many, many people, it would seem the question, if you see something, should you say something or not say something? They tell the story of the Vizhnitzer Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Hager. He would have a custom that every day he would take a stroll for about a half hour, and his his shamash would walk along with him. And one day he was on his stroll, and all of a sudden he passed by a very big, nice-looking home, and he decided all of a sudden to go up the steps to go to this house. And the shamash, this rabbi's helper, was very surprised because the home of this person belonged to not a chassid. In fact, he was from the maskilim, the enlightened ones, the people who were opposed to traditional Judaism. And the Rebbe goes into the home, and the host is quite surprised that the Rebbe is coming there, but he says, okay, come inside, and he smiles, and he invites him in, sit down, and they start talking some pleasantries, but afterwards, after a few moments, the Rebbe is just sitting there, and he's quiet, he's silent, he's not saying anything. 1 minute goes by, 2 minutes go by, and the host is getting a little bit uncomfortable. What's going on over here? The rabbi is not, this Rebbe is not saying anything. So, but he's a very dignified and a person of etiquette, of manners. He doesn't want to question his guest, especially it's a Rebbe. So he gets up and he excuses himself. He goes over to the shamash. He says, "What's going on here?" He says, I don't know what he's doing here. And he goes back and he sits down. And another minute goes by, and nothing. The rabbi's not saying anything. After a few minutes, this Rebbe gets up and he walks towards the door. Strange. So the host follows him. He walks down the steps, and then the Rebbe starts walking home. So he escorts him to his home. Finally, when he gets to the Rebbe's home, he can't contain himself any longer. He can't hold himself in. He says, "Listen, Rebbe, when I was at my house, I was being respectful. You were my guest. I didn't question you. But now I'm at your house. Tell me, why didn't you say anything before? You were keeping quiet the whole time. Very strange." So the Rebbe said, "I came to fulfill a mitzvah. That's why I went to your house." Mitzvah, what kind of mitzvah did you fulfill when you went to my house? He says, well, the Talmud tells us that just like it's a mitzvah to say something that will be listened to, it's a mitzvah to not say something that won't be listened to. Now, what are we talking about? If I sit in my own house and I don't say something, what's the big deal? But I have to go to someone else's house. I went to your house, and over there to be silent, that's a chiddush. And therefore, I went to your house, and I had something to say, and I didn't say it, and then I fulfilled the mitzvah. So now this host is really intrigued. What is he referring to? What kind of mitzvah? He says, tell me, what were you thinking or wanting to say, but deciding not to say it? So the Rebbe says, well, I can't tell you, because if I tell you, I'm going to lose my mitzvah. He says, but how do you know that if you would tell me something, I wouldn't listen? He says, well, that's the thing. I know if I would have said something to you, you wouldn't listen. And therefore, I decided to keep my mouth shut. And therefore, like this, I fulfilled a mitzvah. So the host is mamish intrigued, starts begging and says, please tell me, what was it that you wanted to tell me? And the Rebbe says, sorry, I can't tell you. If I tell you, I'm going to lose my mitzvah. And back and forth. And after a few rounds, finally, the host says, I'm not leaving you. You need to tell me, what did you want to say? So the Rebbe relents and he says, okay, I'll tell you what. So there's this woman in town who is an orphan, a widow, going through a very, very hard time. She was just notified by the bank that they're going to be auctioning her home and repossessing it. And therefore, she's going to be out on the street with her little child. And she came to me and she said she knows that the manager of the bank is yourself. You're a Jewish person. And she asked me if I could speak to you and see if you could do anything. So so I came, but I decided to come to your home. So the host says, hang on a second. You're coming to me. It's not, I'm just the manager of the bank. It's not my money. I don't get to make the decisions. And in fact, I didn't even know about it, but there's actually nothing that I could do. So the Rebbe says, exactly. That's precisely why I didn't tell you anything, because I knew you would say you can't do anything, and therefore you wouldn't listen to me. And that's why I decided to keep silent, and that's my mitzvah. But he says, what do you want from me? It's not, I'm just the manager of the bank. It's not my money. It's not my money to give. It's not my money to take. And the Rebbe says, that's exactly what I was talking about. And he goes into his home. And when the host began to think about this, he took the words to heart. And by the end of the week, he paid off the entire debt, the entire mortgage out of his own pocket. So we see that when it comes to giving criticism, we need to know that on the one hand, you have to know your customer, it seems. So at the end of the day, the question is, if you see something that is not good, that's not right, on the one hand, we know there's a mitzvah to protest and to criticize. On the other hand, there are sources that indicate that there are times that we shouldn't say anything. So how do we reconcile the two? So there's many variations to this, but a general rule of thumb, which we can come to some kind of consensus, is that it depends who exactly is the person you are reproaching, you are reprimanding. If it's somebody that you are familiar with, somebody you have a relationship with, whether it's a sibling, a child, some relationship where you have an influence over the person, so then there is a good chance that if you say it, you will actually have a positive impact on the person. However, if it's somebody that you don't have a good relationship with, and or this person, you know that it won't come across, that they'll take it in a very negative way, it is then that you need to make sure not to say what you want to say. In other words, since there's a condition, the Talmud tells us that in the times that it bemoans the fact that when people try to give criticism, it doesn't go over well. When a person would tell someone, please remove a little splinter from between your teeth, a chip of wood, the person would fire back and say, you're going to tell me to take that? Please remove a beam from in between your eyes. In other words, you're in a glass house and you shouldn't be throwing rocks. So people don't naturally take criticism very well. They see it as a judgment, as condescending, and therefore people are going to naturally bottle up and they're not going to want to take the criticism, even if you mean it in an authentic and genuine way. So on the one hand, we see that to admonish someone is a very, very important principle in the Torah. And in fact, there are times, if it's a Chilul Hashem, there are many circumstances where you need to stand up and say something. However, there are many times that the criticism, it's not so much a deficiency in the person who's the recipient, who's receiving, it's rather sometimes the person who's dispensing, who's giving out the criticism may not be the right person. Or even if they're the right person, maybe it's not the right time, or in the manner that they say it, it's not right. So we need to understand in the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, where it's at the end of the line, and what does he decide to do in his parting words, in his farewell? He criticizes the Bnei Yisrael. But over here, Moshe Rabbeinu is sending us a few important messages. Number one, what he's telling us is that there is a time. There's a time when you should criticize. Rashi tells us, why did Moshe Rabbeinu wait until this moment, after 40 years? He had something to say. Why didn't you say it 40 years ago when you observed the sinning of the golden calf, the Chet HaEgel? If you saw the story of Korach, and say something then. Why are you waiting now? So Rashi says, if Moshe Rabbeinu said like this, if I would have said something years earlier, they would have said, Moshe Rabbeinu, you've brought us nothing but grief and heartaches and headaches. You haven't done anything for us. And therefore, they would think that anything that Moshe Rabbeinu said would be taken with a view that Moshe Rabbeinu is not out there for their good. He's not trying to actually help them. Either he's trying to control them. Either he's just looking down at them. It is only after the story of Sichon and Og, when he conquered them, and they began to come to the threshold of Eretz Yisrael, and they could see their dream. Everything that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke about wasn't just fantasy, but it's actually happening. So they were able to look back in retrospect and see that everything that Moshe Rabbeinu did all of those years was for their benefit, was for their good. And therefore, whatever Moshe Rabbeinu says, they are now open to see things from, not through a prism of or a perspective where Moshe Rabbeinu is just trying to stick it to them. Rather, Moshe Rabbeinu is doing something for their benefit. So an important ingredient, number one, when you criticize, is that it's the most important thing. Why are you criticizing? Why are you admonishing this person? The only effective way can be is if you're doing it out of love. You're actually genuinely concerned that this person is doing something that is destructive, unhealthy, unproductive, whatever reason you think it is not a good thing that the person is doing. So now, out of genuine concern and love, you are telling the person to turn things around or to change something or not do something. If they don't take that as coming from a place of love, it will have the opposite effect. And so Moshe Rabbeinu had to make sure, if he would have said something 40 years earlier, it would fall, at best, would fall on deaf ears. And even worse, they would say, oh, this actually reinforces the notion that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't care about us. He is just mocking us. He is denigrating us. He's putting us down. And it would have the opposite effect of what the Tochacha should have in the first place. Now it's 40 years later. It's only now Moshe Rabbeinu has the confidence to say, I could say something to them and they'll actually take it the right way. The Rebbe said, where did Moshe Rabbeinu learn this? He learned it from his brother Aaron. We know that Aaron, it says in the Mishnah, Oev es habrios umekarven laTorah. He would love the creations of Hashem and bring them closer to the Torah. Why that? Why is there the sequence, love them and then bring them close to the Torah? Because if you want to bring someone closer to the Torah, you, number one, what do you need to do? You need to show them that you love them. When you show them that you care about them, that you're actually concerned about their well-being, physical and spiritual, you actually care about them, then they are going to open themselves up to a possibility. They'll open themselves up to a reality that there is something more that they could do to improve their lives. However, if it is the other way around, and you don't display that sensitivity, that love, that concern to them, then they are not open to that possibility. That's number one. So it's important to do it in the right time. But also, Rashi is telling us, it is the way, the manner that Moshe Rabbeinu. What did Moshe Rabbeinu do? He didn't outright criticize them. He didn't explicitly tell them what they did. It was a very ambiguous and vague criticism. It was veiled through alluding to events that happened by mentioning the geographic locations. Mipnei kvodon shel Yisrael, as Rashi says. It was to protect the dignity, the respect of the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu did not say it direct. He spoke in a very indirect way, because this is another important ingredient. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And that makes all of the difference to the recipient. The Frierdiker Rebbe once observed, he went to receive for various treatments, he had to receive an injection. And he said he noticed that you could learn a hara, you could learn a lesson in the service of Hashem from everything that you observe. And he observed how the doctors, when they would administer this injection, there was a whole procedure. They needed to dress themselves up in what we call PPE, and they had to clean and sterilize the entire area, the site of the injection, and they had to make sure that the room was clean, that the materials that they were using were clean. And they explained that when you inject someone, that the needle penetrates the flesh, you have to make sure that the site is totally sterilized and clean from any foreign material. Because if some of that foreign substance were to get into the flesh, then the injection not only will not help, but it will actually become very severely detrimental to the person. Of course, in today's day and age, with the COVID and all of the sterilization that we're learning about, that's something that, of course, we're very familiar. But the Frierdiker Rebbe said this is exactly what the concept of admonishment, of criticism is like. That sometimes to help another person in various contexts and in various scenarios, it's important to get our point across. It may feel like a prick, like a barb into the flesh of the person. Because it's uncomfortable when a person tells you to mend your ways and to change certain habits, certain routines, patterns that we have in life. However, the most important ingredient is that when we administer this injection to that person, we have to make sure that that site is completely sterilized from any animus, any sense of judgment, condescension, anything that the person will perceive as being anything than altruistically and selflessly loving that person. You're not here to insult them. The person doesn't take the criticism as you're telling the person, you're such a mess, you have no control over your life, let me show you how to do something. Because the worst thing for them to hear is, you're a worthless, you're a nothing. That's how people will naturally take it if they don't think you really love them. If they feel that you truly do love them, then you actually feel that the person cares about your situation and wants to help you rehabilitate and correct that which needs to be corrected. Another interesting point the Rebbe would talk about is when you do criticize someone, what are the first words? What is the opening of your conversation? Do you say right away, the first thing you say is, well, listen, you're doing this wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, you're not allowed to do that? That's not the first thing you're supposed to say. In fact, the first words should be those of positivity, encouragement, and empowerment. The Rebbe says, look at the Torah. The opening of each sefer, of each chumash, is with words of positivity. We start with Bereshis. What is the first words of Bereshis, of the sefer Bereshis? Bereshis. Rashi tells us what is Bereshis, the Beis Reshis, the two firsts, B'Shvil Yisrael, Shenikra Reshis. The Jewish people are called first. That is a term of endearment, that Hashem views every single Jew as the first and the best. And they are there right away at the opening, at the outset of the Sefer. The Chumash of Shemot, Eile Shemot B'nai Yisrael, the Torah enumerates the names of the tribes of the B'nai Yisrael. And Rashi says, why do we begin with the names and mentioning and recounting the names of the Shvatim? Because Hashem, mitochi basam, Hashem loves the Jewish people, and therefore He counts and mentions all of their names. The Sefer Vayikra El Moshe, the word Vayikra, Rashi says, is a lashon chiba. Hashem's calling out to Moshe. It's a term of endearment, how Hashem cherishes and loves him. The Sefer Bamidbar opens up with the counting of the Bnei Yisrael, and Rashi says, brings the explanation, the mitochi basam mono osam kol shah, because Hashem loves and cherishes the Bnei Yisrael, He counts them all the time. He's constantly counting them. And here, in the Sefer of Devarim, even if and when Moshe Rabbeinu does say something that would appear to be criticism, it is said, it's not said in a direct and explicit way, but in a very vague and ambiguous way. So, when you do get around, and it's the right place, it's the right person, it's the right time to say something, you sit down with your child, and you feel that it's the right time to say something to them, and they're open to hearing what you have to say. Make sure that the first thing that they hear, how precious, how amazing they are, how special they are, empower them. Give them a sense that you believe in them. Build them up. And once you do that, then they are going to be in a position to be hearing the constructive, positive words. The words of the constructive criticism will actually build them up instead of bringing them down. And finally, another point is that at the end of the day, when it comes to criticism, admonishment, reproach, what is the best way we could do it? It's not the words that we say. It's not the finesse, and it's the words that we're going to use. At the end of the day, it's how we act. The best form of criticism, the most powerful and impactful thing that we could do for someone to realize that the things that they're doing is not proper, it's if we model a behavior that's different. That's the greatest statement that we could make. The way we behave will have a positive impact on that person. As one of the famous Rebbes attributed to, I've seen it to various people, who said, whether it was the Salanta Rebbe or others, that the Rabbi Yisrael of Salant, who said that initially he tried to change, he had this ambition to change the entire world. But then he came to realize that's not going to work, so he tried to change his entire country. But then that didn't work. He attempted to change his town. But that itself proved too difficult, and he attempted to change his neighborhood. And then he got older and he realized he can't even change that. He attempted to make a transformation in his family. But as he matured, he came to the realization that even that is too much. So he should start with changing himself. But when he changed himself, he realized once he changed himself, that had an impact on his family, which in turn had an impact on his neighborhood, which in turn had a powerful influence on his country, indeed the entire world. So if you do want to make a change, if you see that something needs to be changed, of course, sometimes we have to step up and take a stand. But oftentimes we should look within ourselves and see how we can be better, how we can rehabilitate ourselves. And those around us will be inspired, not by what we say, by what we do. And certainly in these 3 weeks, which, as we mentioned, we spoke about last week, the concept of the times that we live in are very much connected to how not just our relationship with Hashem, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash is not just because of how the barometer, our spiritual barometer in our relationship with Hashem, but with the relationship with our fellow Jew. So if the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was precipitated by sinas chinam, senseless, baseless hatred, so one of the areas, of course, where we can seek to improve is how, even in the name of religion, in the name of righteousness, to admonish, to reprimand somebody, we have to be very, very careful. And certainly if we are able to realize that the words that we say to another person can either build them up or chas v'shalom have the opposite effect, that will certainly have a very, very profound impact on our relationship with others and turn things around in these days of mourning. As the Medrash says, that it's interesting that it is Bilam, the prophet, he was the one that blessed the Jewish people, and it is Moshe Rabbeinu who's criticized us. It's quite ironic how it all came out that way. And the Medrash says, because if Bilam would be the one who would criticize us, they would say, "Oh, it's our enemy. Our enemy criticized us. What? That's not such a big deal." But on the other hand, now that it's Moshe Rabbeinu, the lover of the Jewish people, and they sensed that it came from a true place of love, it had a profound impact on them, because they realized that Moshe Rabbeinu is not out to get them. It's actually something that he's doing for their benefit. So may it be Hashem's will that indeed in these days we should try to be more sensitive, more in our relationship with others. We should try to see things from their perspective, and through our concerted effort to diminish the barbs and the criticisms, and it should be increasing our love for our fellow Jew, intensify our relationship with Hashem. May it be Hashem's will that these days of mourning are transformed to days of joy and festivities, and we should merit, as we this week, Mishenichnas Av Mematim B'Simcha, even though the month of Av is traditionally associated with tragedy and mourning, and the Mishnah says that we need to diminish Mematim B'Simcha, to diminish the joy, as the Hasidic explanation is Mematim B'Simcha, we Mishenichnas Av, when Av arrives and we feel the lack, the mourning, Mematim, we minimize all of that B'Simcha, through the Simcha. May it be Hashem's will, we should all have Simcha in our lives for all of the good things, good health, and Simchas together, and we should merit the coming of Mashiach, the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, Meher V'Yameinu, Amen.